Each beam was wrapped in flesh, and the walls whispered confessions at night. In 1876, Father Elias built a church from corpses. That's right, he used human flesh to construct every beam, every wall, every foundation, believing it would bridge the gap between the living and the dead. His church wasn't made of stone, it was made of the dead, each body a sacrifice to his divine vision. But what started as an act of faith would soon become a nightmare no one could escape. The walls didn't just hold the dead, they whispered confessions at night, secrets of sins long buried. What was meant to be a sanctuary became a prison, and Father Elias, he was no longer a priest. He was a man playing good, and the price would be terrifying. Father Elias rode into Alamo Springs under the harsh sun, the dry, cracked earth stretching endlessly before him. The town lay ahead, a dusty dot on the map of the New Mexico territory, a place forgotten by time. The townspeople were weary, lost in their faith, if they still had any left. Their church, once a beacon of hope, was now nothing more than a broken shell, its stone walls crumbling, the altar long desecrated. But Father Elias had a plan. He wasn't like other priests. No, he didn't believe in simply restoring the old. He had a grand vision, a divine mission that no one could understand. He would rebuild the church, yes, but not with the usual materials of wood or stone. The church, in his eyes, needed something greater, the very souls of the dead. Father Elias was a man obsessed. He believed that to build a truly sacred space, to create a connection between this world and the next, the church had to be formed from the very bodies of those who had passed. Flesh, he thought, was more powerful than stone. It held memories, emotions, souls. And in his warped vision, every beam of flesh wrapped tightly, every wall made of bones, would carry the whispers of the dead whispers that could reach the living, guide them, and protect them. He wasn't just rebuilding a church. He was building a bridge between the living and the dead. The townspeople thought him strange at first. They didn't understand why he was so determined to build this church or why he kept to himself, rarely speaking to anyone. Father Elias didn't seem interested in the usual duties of a priest. No baptisms, no weddings, no funerals. He spent his days walking the outskirts of town, gathering bodies, unclaimed corpses from the graveyard, the remains of those who had died in accidents, in sickness, in violence. He had a reason for this, of course. These weren't just ordinary bodies. Father Elias believed that by using the bodies of the forgotten, he was giving them a second chance, a chance for their souls to find peace. The dead, discarded and abandoned, deserved to be part of something holy, something greater than themselves. So he would use them, honoring their spirits by giving them a new life through his church. But the more Father Elias worked, the more the townspeople began to feel uneasy. They saw him hauling the bodies to the church at night, his hands covered in dirt and blood, his eyes wild with excitement. When he spoke to them, it was never about salvation or God's love. It was always about the power of the dead, the energy they held, and how their presence would make the church a beacon to the divine. No one dared question him directly. He was a priest after all. He was supposed to know better, but something was wrong. The air around the church grew heavy with a sense of dread, and the townspeople began to whisper among themselves. Then came the first sign. One evening, after Father Elias had returned from his daily collection, the sky above the church darkened and a storm rolled in. The wind howled through the town like a wounded animal, rattling windows and knocking over trees. But it wasn't just the storm that caught their attention. The moment the wind struck, the townspeople heard something. They heard voices, whispers, quiet at first, but growing louder as the storm raged. The whispers seemed to be coming from the church itself, from the very walls that Father Elias had been constructing. Some swore they could hear the voices of the dead lost souls crying out for help, speaking in languages they didn't understand. Others believed it was the wind, carrying the echoes of old regrets and forgotten stories. But Father Elias wasn't afraid. He welcomed the whispers, claiming they were the souls of the dead, trying to reach the living, trying to offer their wisdom. The more the voices spoke, the more he was convinced that he was on the right path. This, he believed, was a sign from God himself that the souls he had trapped within the church were trying to communicate. Still, the townspeople were unsettled. They had heard of such things before, whispers of ghosts in the night, of places where the dead refused to rest, but this felt different. The air around the church was thick with something darker, something that went beyond the afterlife. The whispers weren't peaceful, they were desperate. And that was when Maria, a woman from the town who had grown close to Elias, decided to investigate. She snuck into the church late one night, her heart pounding in her chest. The moonlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the rows of bodies that Father Elias had begun to use. The church wasn't just a place of worship anymore. It had become a mausoleum, a grotesque monument to death. And then she heard it. a voice, clear, as though it were speaking directly to her. "Help us." Maria froze, her blood running cold. She couldn't tell where the voice was coming from, but it felt as though it was all around her. From the very walls, the beams of flesh that had begun to rot and decay. The voice wasn't just one voice, it was many. A chorus of souls crying out for release. Father Elias was in the back, chanting softly, his face illuminated by candlelight, his eyes wide with fervor. She approached him, but something stopped her. The air had grown thick, oppressive. As she stepped closer, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The ground beneath her feet felt like it was trembling. It was as if the dead were waking. Maria stepped back, terrified. She had never seen him like this. Elias wasn't just building a church. He wasn't just trying to give the dead peace. He was binding them, trapping their souls in the church, forcing them to live within its walls. But this wasn't just a church anymore. Father Elias had gone beyond the point of no return. The church wasn't a bridge to the afterlife, it was a prison. And the dead weren't offering guidance anymore. They were pleading for freedom. But Elias didn't know that he had already crossed a lineage. Now the dead were starting to demand more than just their bodies. Their whispers were growing louder, and soon they wouldn't just speak, they would scream. Maria's heart raced as she stumbled out of the church, the whispers still echoing in her mind. What had she just witnessed? The walls themselves seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. Father Elias, in his frenzied state, had gone too far. She wasn't sure when exactly he had crossed the line, but it was clear now he wasn't just building a church, he was creating a prison for the dead, a prison where their souls would never escape. The next day, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong. She went about her day in a daze, her mind consumed with what she had heard. But there was a growing sense of dread gnawing at her insides, an urge to understand what Father Elias was really doing. The town had already begun to murmur, to question the priest's methods, but Maria knew they had no idea what was happening behind those crumbling walls. Father Elias had always been different. He had arrived in Alamo Springs with grand ideas, but no one could have imagined the madness that would take hold of him. At first, the town was simply grateful for a priest, someone to guide them, someone to rebuild the faith that had long been abandoned. But now, everything had changed. Maria couldn't ignore the truth she had uncovered. Father Elias wasn't just burying the dead, he was using them. He had started with the unclaimed bodies, the ones left behind by grieving families. But the more he gathered, the more the townspeople began to notice that the bodies were starting to resemble those who had gone missing. People who had disappeared, who no one had heard from in years. Suddenly, their remains were being used to build the church. The priest's work had become increasingly erratic, as if he were desperate to finish something, to finish his creation. One evening, after Mass, Maria went to the cemetery, her mind heavy with the truth she now carried. It was no longer just about the dead, it was about what Father Elias was doing with them. She approached the graves of the missing, her breath caught in her throat as she looked at the names etched into the stones. But as she read, her pulse quickened. Some of the names were too familiar, too close. The name of her own brother, Samuel, stood out. His grave, barely tended, was marked with a simple headstone. He had disappeared 6 months ago. No one had ever found his body, though rumors had circulated about strange sightings in the woods of people being pulled into the darkness. But Father Elias had made no mention of him. And yet something was wrong. The unease Maria felt had grown into certainty. She rushed to the church, and that's when she saw it. Father Elias was in the back room, his hands smeared in blood. He had been working late, collecting more bodies, his obsession growing stronger by the day. The candles flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room, illuminating the walls of flesh and bone. It was as if the building itself was alive, pulsing with some unholy energy. And there, on the altar, was a body Maria recognized. It was Samuel. His body lay stretched out, cold and unmoving, wrapped in cloth and woven into the church's structure. Father Elias hadn't just used the dead for the foundation, he had begun using their very essence, binding them to the church itself. His obsession had taken a turn into the grotesque, each corpse becoming part of something darker, something more than just a building. The dead weren't just sacrifices, they were instruments, playing a part in a ritual that Maria could no longer ignore. "Father," Maria whispered, her voice trembling, "what have you done?" Elias didn't look up at first. He was muttering prayers under his breath, his hands moving rapidly over the body, adjusting it within the structure. When he finally turned to her, his eyes were wheeled, no longer the calm spiritual eyes of the priest she had once known. He looked unhinged. "You see it, don't you?" he asked, his voice low and reverent. "This is the beginning of something extraordinary. This is the church that will transcend life and death. These bodies, they are not just corpses, they are vessels. I'm giving them new purpose and eternal purpose." Maria took a step back, her stomach churning. "You're using their bodies. You're trapping their souls. This isn't holy, Father. It's a desecration." Father Elias smiled, but it wasn't a smile of comfort, it was a smile of madness. "You don't understand, Maria. This is salvation. This is the true path to God. The dead have wisdom, power. We only have to listen. They will guide us. They will protect us." Mariah's legs trembled as the weight of his words sank in. She had been right. The priest wasn't just building a church, he was building a prison, one where the dead could never escape, where they would forever be forced to serve his twisted vision. He was playing Godard in doing so. He had crossed a line that no man should ever cross. "Please," she begged, her voice breaking, "stop. You're killing them all over again. You're condemning their souls to eternity." Father Elias stepped toward her, his face growing more intense with each step. "I am not condemning them," he said fiercely. "I am elevating them. Do you not see the power we are tapping into? The voices, they are guiding me. They are showing me the way to salvation." Mariah's hands trembled as she reached for the nearest object, desperate to find something to defend herself with. But Father Elias didn't seem to notice. He was lost in his delusion, his eyes burning with fanaticism. The church, a twisted labyrinth of human remains, seemed to hum with energy. The air was thick with something dark, something ancient. And then it happened. A crackling sound, a shift in the air. The whisper sounds faint grew louder, more distinct. The dead were waking, but they weren't speaking in kind, gentle voices as Elias had believed. They were angry. The walls groaned as though the very structure of the church was being pulled apart. The bodies seemed to stir, their limbs twitching, their faces contorting. Mariah's heart pounded. She had underestimated the power Elias had tapped into. The dead weren't just passive vessels. They were trapped in, now they wanted out. And as they began to fight back, something far darker started to rise within the church. Father Elias seemed oblivious to the chaos building around him. His eyes remained fixed on the body of Samuel, the last piece of his grotesque puzzle. "The church is almost complete," he whispered to himself. "It will be a sanctuary like no other." But what he didn't realize was that he had already gone too far. The dead were not going to be his. Salvation, were going to be his damnation. And as the first tremor shook the foundation of the church, Maria realized she was no longer just trying to save the dead. She was trying to save herself. But Elias wasn't done. The dead were stirring, and the church was beginning to awaken in ways no one could control. And Father Elias was about to learn that some powers are far too dangerous to harness. Maria didn't sleep that night. She couldn't. The image of her brother Samuel, his body entwined with the grotesque structure of the church, burned in her mind. The priest had gone too far. Father Elias had already crossed a line, and now he was playing with powers far beyond his understanding. By morning, the sun rose, but it felt different. The air seemed thick, suffocating, as if something heavy was hanging over Alamo Springs. It wasn't just the storm that had raged the night before, it was something else, something that had begun to stir beneath the earth. Maria had spent the night pacing, fighting the urge to go back to the church. She knew she had to stop Elias, but how? He was a man consumed by something darker than faith. The voices had become louder, and they were no longer whispers of guidance or comfort. They were something else angry, desperate. But when she heard it again, she froze. The whispers, they were coming from the church clearer than ever before. Only this time, they weren't just coming from the walls. The very ground beneath the church seemed to hum with energy. The dead were not just speaking, they were crying out. Maria rushed to the church. Every step felt heavier than the last. The town around her was eerily quiet. No one was out. No one dared to approach the church anymore, and that scared her even more. What had Father Elias done? She pushed open the heavy wooden doors, the smell of decay instantly hitting her. It was worse than it had been the night before. The air inside felt thick, as if it were charged with something unnatural. The dead seemed to be everywhere, their faces staring out from the walls, their eyes wide, frozen in silent screams. Father Elias was nowhere to be seen. She walked deeper into the church, her footsteps echoing in the hollow silence. The whispers were now so loud they felt like they were vibrating in her skull, the voices overlapping, all desperate, all begging for release. And then, there it was, unmistakable sound of crying. It came from the altar. Mariah's heart raced as she approached, her pulse quickening. As she neared the altar, she saw Father Elias. He was standing there, his back turned to her, muttering something incoherent. His hands trembled as he held something tightly. Maria stepped closer, careful not to disturb him, but the closer she got, the more she could see what he was holding. A knife. No, not a knife. A dagger. The blade was long and twisted, gleaming in the dim light. She had seen it before in his family's crypt. It was an ancient dagger, one rumored to have been used in dark rituals, a relic of the cult Elias' family had been a part of. It was no mere tool for sacrifice, it was a weapon used to bind and control souls. "Father," Maria whispered, stepping into the circle of candlelight. "What are you doing?" Elias didn't answer at first. His hands shook and his lips curled into a twisted smile. "The church is almost complete, Maria," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's becoming more than just a building. It's becoming a sanctuary, a place where the dead can finally speak, where they can guide us." His voice grew louder, more forceful. "The dead want to be here. They want to help us. They're telling me their secrets. This place is becoming more. They are becoming more." Maria stepped back, feeling the cold dread seep into her bones. "No, Father, this isn't salvation. This is madness. You are trapping them. You are imprisoning them for your own selfish reasons." Elias' eyes flickered, and for a brief moment, Maria saw the man he used to be. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by something darker, more malevolent. "You don't understand," he hissed. "This is God's will. This is what I was meant to do. The dead can guide us, Maria. They can give us wisdom, knowledge. They are the true prophets." He raised the dagger high, his eyes wild with fevered devotion. "And I will free them. I will bring them all into this world." The whispers from the walls grew louder, so loud it felt like the building was shaking. Mariah's head spun. She had to stop him before it was too late. "Father, please," she pleaded. "The dead aren't meant to be kept here. They're not guides. You've opened something you can't control." Elias' smile twisted further, his grip tightening around the dagger. "I can control it. I am in control. I am the one who listens. I am the one who can unlock the gates to the afterlife. I will be more than a priest. I will be a prophet, Maria, a savior." He took a step forward, his eyes gleaming with madness. The air around him crackled with energy, electric and cold, like the calm before a storm. Maria stumbled back, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The floor beneath her feet began to tremble. The walls seemed to pulse with the whispers, their voices growing louder, more desperate. And then came the most horrifying sound of Allah's scream. It was not the voice of one person. It was the collective cry of hundreds of souls, all screaming in unison. The sound was deafening, enough to rattle her bones. The bodies in the walls began to move. They shifted, their limbs twitching, their faces twisting in pain. The dead weren't trapped in the walls, they were fighting to break free. And just like that, Father Elias' control shattered. The spirits, now fully awakened, began to claw at the walls, tearing at the beams of flesh and bone. The church seemed to groan in agony as the souls began to fight for freedom, pulling themselves free from their bindings. Elias screamed, his voice rising in both terror and fury. He raised the dagger, ready to strike, but the spirits were already taking control. The dead were no longer his to command. The floor beneath Elias' feet cracked open, and the ground rumbled violently. The church, built from the bones of the dead, seemed to collapse in on itself, as if it were being consumed from the inside out. The screams grew louder, the whispers now turning into wails of rage. Maria backed away, her heart pounding. The dead were no longer just voices, they were an unstoppable force. And Father Elias, the man who thought he could control them, was now caught in the very trap he had set. Father Elias' eyes met hers one last time, wide, terrified, and full of regret. But it was too late. The spirits tore through the church, their vengeful energy ripping apart the walls. The church, once a place of worship, was now a tomb for the souls Father Elias had enslaved. As the church began to crumble, Maria realized the truth. The dead had never been his to control. They were the ones who had controlled him all along. The church had fallen, but the spirits were still restless. What had Elias awakened, and what would the dead demand next? The town of Alamo Springs wasn't safe. Not anymore. The night the church collapsed, the ground itself seemed to groan in agony. The screams of the dead reverberated through the town, rising like a terrifying chorus, echoing from the ruins of the once sacred place. Maria had barely escaped the destruction, running through the streets as the earth trembled beneath her feet. She had no idea what had truly happened to Father Elias, no idea if he had lived or died in the chaos. But there was something else she could feel, something that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. The spirits were still there. The town of Alamos Springs, once sleepy and forgotten, now buzzed with fear. People stayed indoors, their windows shuttered tight. Whispers filled the streets, whispers of ghostly figures seen at night, of voices that seemed to speak in strange tongues, of the ground beneath the ruins still shifting, as though something was trapped beneath it. Maria had seen at firsthand the horror that Elias had unleashed, but what was it that he had truly been trying to do? His obsession with the dead hadn't just been a way to resurrect the forgotten, it had been something darker, something far more dangerous. He had believed that by performing rituals, by using the bodies to form the very bones of his church, he could elevate himself to a higher state. He had thought he could become a prophet, a conduit for the dead. But Father Elias had failed. His creation as sanctuary had become a prison for the souls, a place where they were forever bound to the earth, never to move on. Maria had no idea how to stop it. She was just one person, and the forces Elias had awakened were too powerful. But one thing was certain, she had to try. She had to learn everything she could about the rituals Elias had performed. The truth was buried somewhere in the wreckage of the church, somewhere in the remnants of his madness. The rituals were the key, she was sure of it. They held the answers to how he had turned his church into a tomb band. Maybe, just maybe, they held the key to undoing it all. The next day, Maria returned to the ruins. She was terrified, but she couldn't back down. She had to know. What she found there sent a cold shiver down her spine. The foundation of the church was still intact, though the walls had crumbled away. The bodies, the twisted remains Elias had used to form the structure, were still there, half buried in the wreckage. Some had been pulled free in the chaos, their skeletal hands reaching toward the sky in silent agony. Others had remained, their faces frozen in eternal expressions of pain and fear. But it wasn't the bodies that caught her attention. It was the altar. Amidst the destruction, the altar remained untouched. It was as though the spirits had deliberately spared it, keeping it intact. But what Maria saw on the altar made her blood run cold. A book ancient, worn, and stained with something dark, perhaps blood lay open. The pages were filled with strange symbols, indecipherable words that seemed to shift and change before her eyes. It was a grimoire, a book of dark magic, passed down through generations, filled with forbidden knowledge, and it had been Father Elias' guide. Maria reached out to touch it, but as her fingers brushed the pages, a sharp, cold wind swept through the ruins. The whispers came again, louder this time, echoing in her mind. "You should not have come," the voices warned, but Maria pressed on. The books spoke of rituals, binding rites that could trap the dead in a place between worlds neither here nor there. The bodies, the souls, the very structure of the church had been created through these rituals. The dead were not just kept, they were bound, their spirits chained to the building, trapped in eternal torment. Father Elias had believed he was purifying them, giving them power, but what he had done was far worse. The rituals had turned the church into a gateway that had opened the door to something far darker. But what terrified Maria most was the final page of the book. It was not written in the same symbols as the rest. The handwriting was different, familiar. It was Father Elias. To complete the ritual, the vessel must be offered. The priest must become the final sacrifice. Only then will the gateway be sealed. The souls will be freed, or they will be bound to the church forever. Mariah's breath caught in her throat. The vessel. Elias had been the vessel. He had known what he was doing. He had known that his own soul would be the final sacrifice, but the real horror lay in the words she had just read. The dead weren't trying to move on. They were trying to drag others down with them. She closed the book and stepped back, her heart pounding. The ritual had never been about elevating the souls, it had been about keeping them trapped, feeding off their power. And now the spirits, angry and vengeful, were still bound to the church, unable to move on, growing more and more powerful with each passing day. The dead were growing restless. Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet shook, a violent tremor that rattled the air. The whispers grew into full voices screaming in anguish. The dead were awake. They were no longer content with being prisoners in the church. They were now reaching out, trying to escape. Maria had no time to waste. If she didn't act quickly, the dead would break free and the town would be swallowed in their fury. But there was no simple way to undo the ritual. Father Elias' book had warned of the consequences, and Maria could feel the weight of those warnings in the air around her. The ritual had already begun. Maria knew what she had to do. She had to go deeper into the heart of the church's ruins. But there was something that had been gnawing at her for days. The voices weren't just coming from the dead. They were coming from Elias, the man she had once known, The priest who had been so full of zeal had now become something else. His soul had merged with the church, and now he was part of the very fabric of the building. Father Elias had been consumed by the very power he had sought to control, and now he was waiting for Maria. The ground shook again, more violently this time. It felt like the earth was about to crack open, to swallow the entire town whole. Maria ran back to the altar, clutching the book. She had to finish what Elias had started, but to do so, she would have to face him. The final ritual would require a sacrifice, her sacrifice. As the ground trembled and the voices screamed, Maria made her decision. Maria knew what had to be done, but the price was steep. The ritual could end the nightmare, but at what cost? Father Elias was waiting, and the dead were getting closer. Alamo Springs was no longer the sleepy, forgotten town it had once been. It had become a place of fear, of uncertainty, and of restless whispers that had not ceased since the church-esque destruction. People no longer gathered in the square, they stayed inside. Windows locked, doors barred. The once vibrant community now lived in a perpetual state of dread. They could feel the evil that had been unleashed, the weight of it pressing down on them, suffocating the air around them. Maria had tried to warn them. She had seen the truth, but no one had believed her, no one except for a few who had begun to suspect that something terrible was amiss. The priest who had come to guide them had not been a man of faith, but a man driven by madness, a man who had dared to play God, and, in doing so, had opened a door that should never have been touched. The town was divided. Some still clung to the belief that Father Elias had been a man of God, that his intentions had been pure, that the church was meant to be a place of sanctuary for all. Others, those who had begun to hear the whispers, to feel the weight of the curse that lingered in the air, knew the truth. Elias had been a man consumed by his own hubris, his desire to control the dead, to transcend the human condition. His church had been his temple, but it had become a prison that now held the souls of the dead, souls that would never rest. Maria was caught in the middle, unable to ignore the truth any longer. She knew what had to be done to stop the nightmare, but the cost was steep, and she wasn't sure if she had the strength to follow through. She'd already lost so much: her brother, the town's faith, her peace of mind, but the dead were still restless. Their whispers still echoed through the town, and Elias' creation was far from finished. One night, as she sat in the small, dimly lit room of her home, the sound of footsteps echoed outside. She stood up, her heart pounding. Was it another restless soul? Had the dead come to claim more victims? But as she opened the door, she found not a ghost, but a man of the town's former elders, Henry Thompson, a man who had always been cautious, a man who had kept to himself. He was breathing heavily, his face pale with fear. "Maria," he said, his voice shaky. I've seen them all." Maria stepped back, confused. "What are you talking about?" Henry's eyes darted around nervously, as if he feared the shadows themselves. "The dead. They're walking among us, Maria. I don't know how, but they are. I've seen their faces in the windows. I've heard their voices at night. Two don't know what to do. They're here. They want something." Maria felt a chill creep up her spine. She had feared this day would come, but she hadn't expected it to be so soon. The dead weren't just haunting the ruins of the church. They were now among the living. "Where?" Maria asked, her voice tight with fear. Henry hesitated, his eyes welling up with tears. "In the graveyard by the church ruins. They gathered there in the night. They've been whispering to each other, telling stories. Two don't think they're trapped anymore, Maria. They're coming for us." Mariah's heart raced. This was worse than she could have imagined. Elias had unknowingly opened the door, but it seemed the dead had found a way to free themselves. They were no longer bound to the church, they were loose. And if they weren't stopped soon, they would swallow the entire town. She grabbed Henry's arm, pulling him inside. "You're not going back there alone. I'll go with you. We need to end this before they take more." Henry's eyes widened in protest. "No, we can't. It's too dangerous. The dead, they're not like us anymore. They've changed." Mariah's mind raced. What had Elias truly done? Was the ritual that had bound the souls so strong that it had transformed the dead into something else entirely, something more dangerous? "We have no choice," she said, her voice steady. "I've been to the ruins. I know what needs to be done. The dead won't stop until we finish what Elias started. The church is still calling them. They won't rest until they claim every soul they can." Maria left the house with Henry, the town now silent around them. It was as if the world itself was holding its breath. They made their way through the winding streets to the edge of town, where the church ruins still loomed like a dark, twisted monument to madness. As they approached the ruins, the air grew colder, thicker. The wind no longer whistled through the broken stone, it howled, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of voices, low and mournful. Mariah's skin prickled as she stepped closer to the altar, where the wreckage of Elias' twisted church still stood. The ground beneath her feet seemed to pulse, as if something beneath it was alive, something that had been waiting for her. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, could feel the presence of the dead, restless and angry, as if they knew she was there. And then she saw them, figures, shadowy, half-formed figures, moving through the smoke and debris. Their faces were obscured, but Maria could feel their eyes on Harry's that were full of pain, full of rage. They were the souls Elias had trapped, but they weren't just wandering aimlessly. They were gathering, waiting for something. "Maria," Henry whispered, his voice trembling. They're not human anymore. I can feel it. They want to take us, all of us." Mariah's heart pounded. She knew what she had to do, but she wasn't ready. She wasn't ready to face Elias' legacy, his creation. She stepped forward, her eyes locking onto the altar. The spirits were gathering, murmuring to each other in a language Maria didn't understand. But then, one of them stepped forward, Elias. His face appeared, twisted and gaunt, his eyes hollow, his body stretched and skeletal. It was him, but not him. The priest who had once tried to play God now stood as something else entirely, something unrecognizable. His spirit had become part of the very church he had built. "You came," Elias whispered, his voice hollow, echoing through the ruins. "You think you can stop this? I am more than a man now. I am the bridge between life and death. I am the gatekeeper." Mariah's breath caught in her throat. Elias wasn't just a priest anymore. He was a part of the church, a part of the very prison he had built for the dead, and now he was the one who controlled them. Elias' transformation was only the beginning. The spirits had gained power, and now Maria would have to face the twisted legacy of the man she once knew. Could she stop the dead before they claimed everything? Maria stood frozen, her heart racing as the figure of Father Elias loomed before her. The man she had once known, the priest she had trusted, had become something more, something twisted. His eyes were hollow, his skin stretched tight over his bones, his form unnaturally thin. There was nothing left of the man she had admired. What stood before her now was a living nightmare, an incarnation of the very church he had built from death. "You came to stop me," Elias' voice echoed through the ruins, hollow and distorted, like a whisper from the grave. "But you are too late, Maria. The dead are here. They are with me now, and there is no escaping them." Maria's pulse thundered in her ears as she stepped back, her gaze darting around the ruins of the church. The spirits, restless and angry, gathered around them, their shadowy figures flickering in and out of existence. Their eyes were filled with rage, with hunger. She could feel their presence pressing in, suffocating her, as if they were drawing closer, waiting for the moment when they would claim her as one of their own. But Elias was still speaking, his voice growing more frenzied with each word. "I have freed them, Maria. I have unlocked their power. The dead will no longer be bound by the limits of this world. They will transcend it, just as I will. I will become their leader, their master. We will rule over the living." Mariah's throat went dry, and her hands trembled at her sides. The truth was becoming clearer, but it was more horrifying than she could have imagined. Elias hadn't just been trying to control the dead, he had been trying to merge with them, to become one with the spirits trapped in the church. He had believed that by doing so he would transcend death itself, that he would become a being of ultimate power. But instead, he had become something worse, a vessel. Yes, but a vessel for the dead to use as a conduit to the living. He had unlocked the gateway to the afterlife, but the spirits had not thanked him for. They were using him. They were feeding on his energy, drawing power from the very structure of the church. Elias had become their puppet, his soul nothing more than a tool for their resurrection. "You see, Maria," Elias continued, his voice now full of manic glee, "the dead were never meant to be at rest. They were meant to rule, and now I am their chosen. The rituals I perform in this church have given them a voice. I've given them power." Maria felt the weight of his words sink in. Elias had believed he was creating something holy, something divine, but all he had done was unleash a terror beyond anyone's control. The dead weren't trying to guide or protect. They were hungry, they were vengeful, they wanted freedom, but they were willing to take everything in their path to get it. As the whispers around them grew louder, Maria could hear the voices of the dead. Their cries were no longer whispers, they were howls of agony and rage, their souls twisted by the rituals Elias had performed. They were not free, they were more trapped than ever before. bound to the earth by the very walls of the church, their power feeding off of Elias' madness. Maria had to act, but she knew the consequences of failure would be catastrophic. She had no time to think. The spirits were growing stronger, the energy of the church surging like a pulse, a rhythm of power that was about to break free from its confines. Elias was no longer in control, the dead were. And now, Maria was the only one standing, between them and the world outside. "You can't control them, Elias," she said, her voice steady but full of desperation. "You've created a prison, not a sanctuary. The dead are still trapped there, still suffering. They'll never be at peace, not until you put them to rest." Elias' eyes flickered with madness. Peace? The dead don't seek peace. They seek power. They seek dominion. They want to be worshipped. And now, I will give them that. Maria knew she had to stop him. She had to undo the ritual. But she couldn't do it alone. The book, the one that Father Elias had used to create the rituals, still lay somewhere in the ruins. It was her only hope, the only way to reverse the damage Elias had done. But how could she possibly find it now, with the church collapsing around them, the spirits growing more powerful with each passing moment? As if on cue, the ground beneath her feet trembled again. The earth groaned, a deep, rumbling sound that echoed from the bowels of the earth itself. The walls of the church seemed to shudder, as if the very structure was alive. And then came the voice. Not Elias, not the dead's. It was something else. A low guttural growl that seemed to rise from the depths of the earth, deep and primal. The voice of something far older than the spirits Elias had released. The voice of death itself. Maria spun around, her heart racing in her chest. A figure stood before her, emerging from the darkness of the crumbling church, its form towering, its body a mass of shifting shadows and bone. It was something between life and death, a creature made of both flesh and the afterlife. Its eyes burned with an ancient, malevolent fire. The creature spoke in a language Maria didn't understand, its voice a chorus of hundreds of souls twisted into one. But the meaning was clear. The dead had been set free, and now they were no longer bound by the rituals Elias had performed. They had evolved into something far more terrifying. Elias stepped back, his face paling as he stared at the creature. His own creation was now beyond his control. The power he had sought had turned on him. No, this isn't what I wanted," he cried, his voice rising in terror. Maria felt a rush of cold air, and the whispers around her turned into screams. The dead were angry, furious that they had been awakened only to be enslaved once more. The creature's presence was a catalyst, something that Elias had never anticipated. He had opened the door, but now the true power had entered. The creature stepped forward, its shadow stretching across the ruins of the church. It was no longer just a soul, it was an entity born of both life and death, a force of nature that had existed long before Elias had ever dreamed of building his twisted sanctuary. Maria knew what she had to do. She had to end this, or the creature and the spirits would destroy everything in their path. The ritual was the only way, but she would have to sacrifice herself to close the gateway. There was no other choice. With a final, defiant look at Elias, Maria turned and ran toward the altar, knowing that the last step in the ritual would cost her life. The creature's growl echoed in her ears, but she had no choice. The dead could not be allowed to rule the world of the living. She had to stop them, even if it meant giving up everything. Maria had made her decision, but the creature wasn't finished yet. The battle for control of the dead had only just begun. Would she make it in time to stop the forces she had unwittingly unleashed? Maria stood before the altar, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands trembling as they hovered over the ancient grimoire. The very ground beneath her feet was shaking, the ruins of the church crumbling with each passing second. The whispers, now deafening, filled her ears, voices of the dead, furious and desperate, all clawing at the fabric of reality. The air was thick with their rage, as if the dead were reaching out, demanding retribution. Elias had gone too far. His obsession with controlling the dead had turned them into something worse than he could have ever imagined. But it wasn't just the dead that had grown stronger. The creature, the ancient force Maria had seen before her, is far more dangerous than anything she had anticipated. It wasn't just a soul, a spirit. It was a manifestation of something ancient, something that had existed long before Elias' madness had begun. The creature stood before her, its body a twisted amalgamation of shadow and bone, its eyes burning with an unholy fire. It wasn't just hungry, it was vengeful. It was the physical embodiment of everything Elias had unlocked, every soul he had bound, every boundary he had crossed. The dead were no longer prisoners who were free, and now they had a champion, something far more terrifying than Elias had ever been. Maria, Elias' voice cracked from behind her. but she didn't turn. His words were desperate, weak. "Please stop. This is the only way. The dead can't be stopped. They will take everything." He had nothing left. The power had consumed him, and now he was just a shell, a puppet of the creature that stood before her. He had played with forces beyond his control, and now it was too late for anyone to escape the consequences. She clenched her fists, pushing the grief and fear deep down. She couldn't listen to him anymore. She couldn't listen to anyone. The only thing that mattered now was ending this nightmare before it spread, before the dead ravaged the town, the world. The creature's shadow stretched across the ruins, its whispers louder than the others. It knew what she was planning. Mariah's eyes darted to the grimoire, her heart pounding in her chest. The ritual had always been clear in the book. She had to complete it, a final step. But the price was steep. Her fingers brushed the pages again, the words seeming to shift and writhe before her eyes. She had read the incantation over and over in her mind, memorized it in the dead of night. The ritual was dangerous, there was no question about it. It would tear the veil between the worlds and close the gateway. But there was no escaping it now. If she didn't do this, everything would be lost. The creature stepped forward, a twisted smile forming on what could have been its face. "You think you can stop me? You think you can stop the dead?" It spoke in Elias' voice, but it was distorted, like 100 voices mixed into one. Elias wanted to use the dead to gain power. "I've already gained it. I am power." Mariah's stomach churned as she stepped back, trying to steady her breath. She had no idea what would happen next. The ritual wasn't just about sealing the dead away, it was about sacrificing the living to keep them bound. She had read it clearly. It would require her life to close the gateway. There was no other way. As the creature loomed closer, its eyes glowing brighter, Maria realized the full horror of what Elias had done. The dead weren't just trapped, they were part of the very foundation of the world. The more the dead had been trapped in the church, the more power they had accumulated. The creature standing before her was a reliquary, a vessel for the souls, a creature born of their collective rage. It wasn't just the souls of the dead. It was the very death that had been held captive. Maria, Elias whispered from behind her, his voice full of regret. "I didn't know. I didn't realize what I had created. I was a fool. But it's too late. The dead, they will destroy us all." His words were empty. Now, he was a man undone by his own ambition, a man who had tried to control the uncontrollable, and now the price of that ambition was written in the very ruins of the church. Maria turned to face him, her heart heavy with the knowledge that there was no other way. The grimoire was the only key to ending the torment the dead had suffered. It was the only key to shutting the door to the afterlife, to banishing the darkness Elias had unleashed. Without another word, she raised the daguerreon of the last remnants of the ritual land, slammed it into the altar. The earth trembled violently beneath her feet, and a blinding light exploded from the altar. The creature howled in fury, its form disintegrating as the ritual took hold. Elias screamed, his voice splitting with terror. "No, you don't understand. You can't stop them." They'll never, but his words were drowned out by the deafening sound of the earth cracking, the sound of the dead being sealed away once again. The walls of the church began to collapse, the foundation cracking, splitting open, as though the very earth was swallowing the church whole. The ground beneath Maria's feet shook violently. The spirits, their cries now maddened with rage, began to dissipate. Their forms turned to mist, to vapor, fading into the light, disappearing one by one. The creature's form twisted and shrank, its strength crumbling beneath the weight of the ritual. Father Elias fell to his knees, his hands outstretched, as if begging for mercy. But it was too late. He was already lost. Maria closed her eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the sacrifice in her chest. The church was falling apart around her, but she could feel the power of the ritual course through her veins. She wasn't sure what would happen next. The dead were sealed, the spirits at peace. But what would become of Elias? Would the souls he had bound to the church ever truly be free? As the last of the light from the altar faded, Maria opened her eyes to find herself standing alone in the ruins. The creature was gone. The dead had been sealed. But Elias, there was nothing left of him. His body was gone. He had become part of the very darkness he had sought to control. The town of Alamos Springs had been saved, but at a terrible cost. The town would rebuild. The dead would no longer haunt the earth. But Maria would forever bear the weight of the sacrifice. And the question would remain, how long would peace last? The town of Alamos Springs was still reeling from the horrors that had unfolded. The once bustling streets were now quiet, as if the very life had been drained from them. The ruins of the church, now a shadow of what it had been, loomed over the town like a reminder of the madness that had taken root. The spirits, the creature, and Elias, all of it had been sealed away, but something lingered in the air. Something wasn't finished. Maria, now alone in the aftermath of the ritual, could feel the weight of the town's trauma pressing down on her. She had given everything to save them, but what had truly been saved? The dead had been put to rest, yes, but the souls of those who had been trapped in the church were gone. And Father Elias, he was nowhere to be found. His body, his essence, everything had dissolved into the very foundation of the church, leaving only an echo of the man he had once been. Maria walked through the empty streets, her steps heavy. The town hadn't yet rebuilt itself, and the scars of the past were still fresh. She had seen the horrors of the dead, heard their voices, felt their rage. But something else was gnawing at her. The final ritual had worked, hadn't it? The gateway had been sealed, the spirits had been freed, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. She stopped at the edge of the town, staring at the distant ruins. The wind had kicked up, swirling around the wreckage of the church, and for a moment she swore she could hear faint whispers, muffled voices coming from the ruins. Her stomach twisted. No, it couldn't be. The spirits were supposed to be at peace. They were gone, but were they? As if on cue, the ground beneath her feet trembled. A faint rumble like the earth itself was waking up. The whispers grew louder, more distinct, as though they were right beside her. Maria turned toward the church ruins, dread creeping up her spine. The ritual had been completed. There was no reason for the dead to return, but something was wrong. Before she could move, a figure stepped. From the Shadosa man, or what used to be one. His face was gaunt, hollow-eyed, his body disfigured. It was Elias, or what remained of him. His presence felt cold, like the grave. He was no longer just a mana priest. He had become something else, something far worse. "Maria," Elias rasped, his voice like the scraping of bones against stone. "You thought you had ended it, didn't you? You thought you had freed the souls, but I never said that the dead would stop. I was only their first vessel. Now, I am their king." Mariah's heart skipped a beat. She had thought Elias was gone, vanished, absorbed into the earth, never to return. But what stood before her was not a man. It was a remnant of him, corrupted and twisted by the very power he had unleashed. "What have you become?" she whispered, stepping back. Elias smiled, though his lips barely moved. "You don't understand, do you? I didn't just control them, I became them, you sealed. The spirits away, yes, but you forgot the true price of playing God. I have transcended. I have merged with the dead, with all of their power." Maria felt a chill crawl up her spine. It wasn't just his body that had dissolved into the church, it was his very soul. He had crossed a line that no man should ever cross, and now the dead had made him their vessel. He stretched out his arms, and the ground around them cracked open. From the earth, figures began to rise, shadows of the dead, their forms twisted, their faces a grotesque mockery of life. The church ruins had become a portal, a gateway to the dead, a living prison from which they could never escape. And now, Elias was their king, their ruler, their bridge. The dead were not gone. They had simply been waiting. Mariah's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the power of the dead radiating from Elias, feel the spirits clawing at her from every direction. There was no running. There was no hiding. "They want me," Elias whispered, as if speaking to himself. "They've always wanted me. And now, I've given them everything. Everything." Mariah's hands clenched into fists. "No, I won't let you." Elias raised his hand, and the ground trembled again. "You can't stop it. I am the king now. I am death." The shadows around them thickened, swirling as if the earth itself was alive. The dead, all of them, were rising, and Elias had become their ruler. It wasn't just the souls he had trapped in the church. It was every soul that had ever been lost, every person who had ever died in this town, and now Elias would control them all. Maria felt the weight of it. The dead weren't just trapped in the ruins, they were rising. The church, a prison for their souls, had become their throne. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, but in an instant, Elias was standing right in front of her, his cold eyes staring down at her. His smile was twisted, full of madness. "You didn't understand, did you? You sealed them away, but you never stopped them. Now they will rise, and I will lead them." His form flickered, and for a brief moment Maria saw something terrifying: the dead, all of them, shifting, swirling around him like a massive, angry storm. It was happening. The town was about to be consumed by the very forces that Elias had unleashed. Maria knew what she had to do. She had one final chance to stop this, but she had to act fast. Without warning, She turned and ran toward the church ruins, the portal. That was the only way to stop him. The gateway had to be sealed forever. Elias' laughter echoed behind her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The portal was still open. The dead were rising, and Elias' reign had only just begun. Maria had one last chance to end this, but it would cost her more than she ever imagined. Mariah's feet pounded against the earth as she ran toward the ruins of the church, the ground still shaking beneath her. The air was thick with the dead's presence, a suffocating weight pressing in from all sides. Elias' voice echoed in the distance, the sound of his laughter twisting in her mind like a poison. He had become something far worse than Aman had become death itself. She didn't know how much longer she had. The dead were rising and Elias was their king. He had become their bridge between life and death, and now he was unstoppable. But Maria couldn't give in to the fear. She couldn't let the town, the people, fall into the abyss. The ruins of the church loomed before her like a shattered monument to madness. The broken stone walls seemed to pulse with a sickening energy, as if the very ground was alive. The dead were already gathering around the altar, their faces twisted in anger, their bodies half-formed, spectral figures drifting in and out of existence. Mariah's breath was ragged as she stumbled into the church, her hands clutching the grimoire tightly. This was the only way. The book had warned her, but the warning came too late. Father Elias' rituals had opened the door to the dead, but it wasn't just the souls of the long dead that had come through. Elias had become the very thing he had sought to control, and now the price of his ambition was too great to bear. She had seen the consequences. She had heard the dead crying for release, their suffering echoing in the ruins, but she had also seen the creature Elias had unleashed at the true power of the dead, twisted and hungry, a force that had devoured him from the inside out. The altar was before her now, a twisted focal point of darkness, its surface slick with the remnants of the rituals Elias had performed. She had no time to hesitate. The final step was here. She had to seal the portal, or the dead would rule forever. Elias would rule forever. But as she stepped closer to the altar, she felt the weight of her decision. The grimoire whispered in her hands, the pages turning under her fingertips. There was a price to pay. There always had been. And this time, the price was her soul. She closed her eyes, the words of the ritual clear in her mind. The sacrifice. The ritual would close the gateway, but only if the vessel Mary gave herself to the spirits. Her life would fuel the seal. Her soul would bind the dead to their resting place. And once the ritual was complete, the dead would finally be at peace. The voices of the dead were growing louder, their cries building into a crescendo of rage. They could feel her. They knew what she was about to do. Elias' voice rang out from the shadows, cold and bitter. "You can't stop it, Maria. I've already become more than you could ever understand. The dead are mine. They will always be mine." Maria spun around, her hand still holding the grimoire. Elias was there, his face a mask of fury. His body flickered in and out of existence like a fading shadow, but his Aisha's eyes were full of hatred. "You lost, Elias," Maria said, her voice trembling but determined. "You played God, and now the price has come due." Elias laughed, the sound grating on her nerves. "You think you can undo what I've done? You think your soul will be enough to close the gate? You'll never defeat me. I am the king of the dead." The ground beneath them trembled again, the altar glowing with an unholy light. Elias' form began to shift, his body becoming ethereal, his essence spreading like smoke, filling the room with dark energy. His voice, now a thousandfold, roared, "You're too late." Maria could feel the power of the dead surge through the church, the cold of their souls wrapping around her. But she knew now, she knew the truth. Elias wasn't just playing God, he had become God, or at least the God of the dead. He had ruled them, controlled them, and now they were his to command. But she wasn't going to let him win. She raised the grimoire high, her eyes locked on the altar, and began to chant the final incantation, her voice steady despite the chaos swirling around her. The dead howled, their voices crashing against the walls, trying to break through, trying to stop her. And then it happened. The ground split open beneath her feet, and the earth trembled with an explosion of energy. A bright light filled the church, blinding her for a moment, and the dead screamed in unison, their voices growing louder, more powerful. But Maria didn't stop. She focused on the ritual. She focused on the sacrifice. With a final heart-wrenching cry, she finished the chant. The light flared brighter than ever, consuming the entire church, and Maria felt her body begin to dissolve. The spirits, once angry and vengeful, began to fade, their forms breaking apart, their cries silenced. The gate was closing. But as the light intensified, Mariah's vision blurred, her body fracturing into the very fabric of the ritual. She had given herself to the dead, her soul, her life, all sacrificed to stop Elias' madness. The light began to fade, and the church fell silent. The dead were sealed, Elias' reign ended, but at what cost? Maria had sacrificed herself to close the gateway, but was it truly over? The town had been saved, or had it? The town of Alamo Springs lay in eerie silence. As the final echoes of the ritual faded into nothing, the church, once a towering monument to madness, had crumbled into ruin. The portal to the dead was sealed, and the spirits, freed from their prison, had faded back into the shadows, their whispers now silenced forever. But Maria was gone. Her sacrifice had sealed the fate of the dead and closed the gateway Elias had opened, but it had come at a cost, her life. As the dust settled over the remains of the church, the town of Alamo Springs began to stir again, slowly returning to what it once was. The heavy air of dread that had clung to the streets began to lift, replaced by a stillness that felt unnatural. No one spoke of the horrors that had unfolded in the church. No one spoke of Elias, of his descent into madness, or of the ritual that had nearly consumed them all. There were only whispers now, half-forgotten murmurs in the wind, of a priest who had played God and of a woman who had given everything to stop him. The town tried to move on. People rebuilt their homes, their businesses, and their lives. But something had shifted. There was an unspoken understanding, a quiet fear that hung over Alamo Springs like a shadow. The dead were gone, but were they? And what of the church? One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the town in the kind of twilight that felt thick with secrets, a lone figure stood at the edge of the ruins. Mariah's mother, once a woman of faith and strength, now wore the haunted look of a mother who had lost everything. She had heard the stories, seen the changes in the town, and felt the weight of loss deep in her soul. She stared at the ruins of the church, the once grand structure now reduced to a pile of rubble and broken stone. It had once been a place of worship, a sanctuary. Now it was nothing but a graveyard for the souls who had been trapped by Elias' twisted ambitions. Mariah's mother stepped forward, her feet crunching on the dust that had settled like ash. She had come to say goodbye, to honor the sacrifice of her daughter. But as she walked deeper into the ruins, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, an unshakable presence that she could not explain. The whispers began again, faint at first, barely audible. But they grew louder with each step she took. At first, Mariah's mother thought she was imagining it, the last remnants of grief and fear playing tricks on her mind. But no, it wasn't her imagination. The whispers were real. The voices of the dead, of those trapped in the church, were still here. She turned, her heart racing. She wasn't alone. From the shadows of the ruins, a figure emerged. A man hunched, his body twisted and decayed. His eyes glowed with an unnatural fire. Mariah's mother recognized him immediately. It was Elias, but he was no longer a man. He had become something else, something horrible. Elias stepped forward, his voice low and filled with the venom of the dead. "You think it's over, don't you? You think Mariah's sacrifice closed the door for good?" His smile was grotesque, a mockery of the priest he had once been. But the price of playing God is never that simple. The dead they do not forget, and neither do I. Mariah's mother stepped back, but Elias was too quick, his form flickering like a mirage. He was the bridge, the one who had connected the living to the dead. And though Maria had sealed the gate, she had not destroyed the power Elias had unleashed. "The dead are free," Elias whispered, "but they are still my dead, and they will never let me go. We will never let you go." Suddenly, the ground beneath her feet trembled, and the church ruins groaned. From the cracks in the stone, shadowy forms began to rise, figures disfigured and broken, the spirits of the dead that had been freed by Mariah's sacrifice. But now they were not just spirits. They had become something worse, something horrible. Mariah's mother's heart pounded. The spirits, the dead, were rising once more. They weren't gone, they were evolving, and they had Elias to thank for it. "You can't escape, you know," Elias said, his voice now 100 whispers, 100 souls bound together. "None of you can. We are everywhere now. The dead, the ones I have freed, the ones you tried to bury, they are coming for you." But as Elias advanced, something unexpected happened. A bright light erupted from the ruins, blinding and pure. It was not from Mariah's mother, but from the very foundation of the church itself, from the altar that had once held Elias' twisted power. A surge of energy flooded the ruins, a force so overwhelming that even Elias paused, his eyes wide with confusion. Mariah's voice echoed in the light. "You thought you controlled the dead, Elias. You thought you could control death itself, but you never understood. Death is not something to be controlled. It is something that frees. And now you are free. The light exploded outward, and for a moment, the ruins trembled with the power of it. The dead screamed, their forms twisting in agony. The portal was closing again, but this time, it wasn't just a seal, it was the end. The dead were being dragged back to where they belonged. Mariah's mother stumbled back, her eyes wide with disbelief. The spirit of her daughter, glowing with ethereal light, stood before her. "It's over, Mother," Maria whispered, her voice soft but strong. "It's finally over." Elias' form flickered again, his body disintegrating as the light consumed him. The spirits, too, were pulled back into the earth, their cries fading as they were sealed once more, their forms dissipating into nothing. The town of Alamo Springs, forever changed, was left in silence. The dead were gone. Elias' reign was over. Mariah's sacrifice had been the key, the ultimate price. Mariah's mother collapsed to her knees, tears streaming down her face, a silent prayer on her lips. The town, though forever marked by the horrors they had witnessed, had been saved, and in the quiet of the ruins, Mariah's voice could still be heard, a whisper on the wind, the dead will rest, and so will we. Final payoff. The town of Alamo Springs had been saved, but its scars would never fade. The ruins of the church still stood, a silent reminder of the horrors that had unfolded. The dead, once freed, were now at rest. Elias, who had tried to play God, was gone, his soul devoured by the very force he had sought to control. Mariah's sacrifice had sealed the portal, but at a cost no one could have predicted. She was gone, her life given to restore the balance. Yet even as the town rebuilt, something lingered in the air, a faint whisper on the wind. The dead might have been sealed, but the memories of their suffering lived on. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the earth, the echoes of Elias' ambition could still be felt, a haunting reminder that some forces once unleashed can never truly be contained.